Richard Dawkins has written The Ancestor's Tale, a pilgrimage to the dawn of evolution. Next, he reads selections from the book and is joined in the presentation by his wife. This is just over an hour.
Well, good evening. I would like to welcome everybody out tonight. We have a packed house, and it's brilliant to see. My name is Michael Link. I'm the operations manager here at Politics and Prose. And this is actually the third time that I have encountered Richard Dawkins, who, if you don't know, will be speaking tonight. If you thought it was somebody else, then you should give up your seat now, because there are people waiting. The first time was when I was in college studying philosophy, which is a bad choice, unless you want to end up here, which then would be a good choice. When I was studying his book, The Blind Watchmaker. The last time, when we were speaking before the event, I realized when we hosted an event for the Devil's Chaplain was actually when President Bush had traveled to England, and there was mass protests there. And now that we're having an event for his newest book, The Ancestor's Tale, I realized that Tony Blair's here. So I've come to think of Richard Dawkins as kind of an ambassador of international relations. When he puts out a new book, it sort of it bodes well, at least for the two members of the Coalition of the Willing. And don't forget Poland. So I also think that this is an amazing time, because I've been reading recently about a number of school districts across the country who have since, have since begun to pave the way for intelligent design or creationism to be taught in public schools. And if any of you have ever read anything written by Richard Dawkins, you know that he is not necessarily the biggest proponent of such a scientific view. And it was actually during this latest round, as I was finishing his latest book, which is without a doubt brilliant. It's brilliant from the point of view. It's brilliantly written, and it's amazing that it wasn't quite enough to write a book about our ancestors, to write a book about evolutionary biology. But I guess just to make it a challenge, Richard wrote it in sort of the style of the Canterbury Tales. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight, as many of you know who are here for the Devil's Chaplain, what is an absolutely brilliant presentation. I now turn the mics over to Richard and Lalla.
Tony Blair may be willing, but he's alone in our country. The Ancestor's Tale, as you've heard, is modelled vaguely after the Canterbury Tales. The main thing that distinguishes it from any other history is that it goes backwards. And the first chapter, The Conceit of Hindsight, explains the rationale for going backwards. It is a conceit of hindsight to see evolution as aimed towards some particular end point, such as ourselves. A historically minded swift, understandably proud of flight as self-evidently the premier accomplishment of life, might regard swift kind, those spectacular flying machines with their swept-back wings who stay aloft for a year at a time and even copulate in free flight, as the acme of evolutionary progress. To build on a fancy of Steven Pinker, if elephants could write history, they might portray tapirs, elephant shrews, elephant seals, and proboscis monkeys as tentative beginners along the main trunk road of evolution. Taking the first fumbling steps, but each, for some reason, never quite making it, so near yet so far. Elephant astronomers might wonder whether, on some other world, there exist alien life forms that have crossed the nasal Rubicon and taken the final leap to full proboscitude.
We are neither swifts nor elephants, we are people. As we wander in imagination through some long-dead geological epoch, it's humanly natural to reserve a special warmth and curiosity for whichever otherwise ordinary species in that ancient landscape is our ancestor. It's an intriguingly unfamiliar thought that there's always one such species. It's hard to deny our human temptation to see this one species as on the main line of evolution, the others as supporting cast, walk-on parts, sidelined cameos. Without succumbing to that error, there is one way to indulge a legitimate human centrism while respecting historical propriety. That way is to do our history backwards, and it is the way of this book.
The Ancestor's tale is cast in the form of an epic pilgrimage from the present to the past. All roads lead to the origin of life, but because we are human, the path we shall follow will be a human pilgrimage to discover human ancestors. As we go, we shall greet other pilgrims who join us at a series of rendezvous points as we encounter the common ancestor we share with each of them.
The first fellow pilgrims we greet, some 5 million years ago, deep in Africa, where Stanley memorably shook hands with Livingstone, are the chimpanzees. 1 million years further into the past, the gorillas join us, then the orangutans, next the gibbons, then monkeys, and so on until we finally greet the bacteria, after which all the pilgrims march together in one single backward quest for the origin of life itself, life's Canterbury.
Following Chaucer's lead, my pilgrims, which are all the different species of living creature, have the opportunity to tell tales along the way. It is these tales that form the main substance of the book. Incidentally, I decided it would be twee to let them tell their tales in the first-person singular. And as with Chaucer's tales, they're not necessarily about the teller, but they carry a message about life or evolution in general. Surprisingly, there are only 39 of these rendezvous as we journey back, the bacteria being rendezvous 39. And in these readings, we'll just jump through just a few of these rendezvous and a few of the tales. We go first to rendezvous 2, which is about 7 million years into the past, where the gorilla pilgrims join us. The gorilla's tale. The rise of Darwinism in the 19th century polarized attitudes towards the apes. Opponents who might have stomached evolution itself balked with visceral horror at cousinship with what they perceived as low and revolting brutes, and desperately tried to inflate our differences from them. This was nowhere more true than with gorillas. Apes were animals. We were set apart. Worse, where other animals such as cats or deer could be seen as beautiful in their own way, gorillas and other apes, precisely because of their similarity to ourselves, seemed like caricatures, distortions, grotesques.
Darwin never missed an opportunity to put the other view, sometimes in little asides, such as his charming observation in The Descent of Man, that monkeys smoke tobacco with pleasure. Nowadays, scientists not only think we resemble apes, we include ourselves within the apes, specifically the African apes. We emphasize, by contrast, the distinctness of apes, including humans, from monkeys. To call a gorilla or a chimpanzee a monkey is a solecism.
It has not always been so. In former times, apes were frequently lumped with monkeys, and some of the early descriptions confused apes with baboons or with Barbary macaques, which indeed are still known as Barbary apes. More surprisingly, long before people thought in terms of evolution at all, and before apes were clearly distinguished from each other or from monkeys, great apes were often confused with humans. Agreeable as it would be to approve this apparent prescience of evolution, it unfortunately may owe more to racism. Early white explorers in Africa saw chimpanzees and gorillas as close kin only to black humans, not to themselves. Interestingly, tribes in both Southeast Asia and Africa have traditional legends suggesting a reversal of evolution as conventionally seen. Their local great apes are regarded as humans who fell from grace. Orangutan means man of the woods in Malay.
A picture of an orangutan by the Dutch Dr. Bontius in 1658 is, in T.H. Huxley's words, nothing but a very hairy woman of rather comely aspect and with proportions and feet wholly human. Hairy she is, except oddly, in one of the few places where a real woman is. Her pubic region is conspicuously naked. Also very human are the pictures made a century later by Linnaeus's pupil Hoppius in 1763. One of his creatures has a tail, but is otherwise wholly human, bipedal, and carries a walking stick. Pliny the Elder says that the tailed species have even been known to play at checkers.
One might have thought that such a mythology would have prepared our civilization for the idea of evolution when it arrived in the 19th century, and might even have accelerated its discovery. Apparently not. Instead, the picture is one of confusion between apes, monkeys, and humans. This makes it hard to date the scientific discovery of each species of great ape, and it's often unclear which one is being discovered. The exception is the gorilla, which became known to science the most recently. In 1847, an American missionary, Dr. Thomas Savage, saw in the house of another missionary on the Gaboon River a skull represented by the natives to be a monkey-like animal, remarkable for its size, ferocity, and habits. The unjust reputation for ferocity was later to be hyperbolized in the story of King Kong. Judging from its location, Savage's species must have been the western gorilla, gorilla. The mountain gorilla was discovered, he shot it, by the German Robert von Behringer as late as 1902. As we shall see, it is now regarded as a subspecies of the eastern gorilla, and the whole eastern species now, unfairly one might think, bears his name, Gorilla beringii.
The pygmies, originally mentioned by Homer and Herodotus as a legendary race of very small humans, were later assumed by 17th and 18th century explorers to be none other than the chimpanzees then being discovered in Africa. Tyson, 1699, shows a drawing of a pygmy, which, as Huxley says, is plainly a young chimpanzee, although it too is depicted walking upright and carrying a walking stick. Now, of course, we use the word pygmy for small humans again.
This leads us back to the racism which, until relatively late in the 20th century, was endemic in our culture. Early explorers often assigned the native peoples of the forests a closer affinity with chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangs than with the explorers themselves. In the 19th century, after Darwin, evolutionists often regarded African peoples as intermediate between apes and Europeans on the upward path to white supremacy. This is not only factually wrong, it violates a fundamental principle of evolution. Two cousins are always exactly equally related to any outgroup because they are connected to that outgroup via a shared ancestor. For reasons given in the bonobo's tale, all humans are exactly equally close cousins to all gorillas. Racism and speciesism and our perennial confusion over how inclusively we wish to cast our moral and ethical net are brought into sharp and sometimes uncomfortable focus in the history of our attitudes to our fellow humans and our attitudes to apes, our fellow apes. Moving back now from Rendezvous 2 to Rendezvous 10, back to 75 million years ago, where we're joined by the rodents. Rendezvous 10, rodents.
Rodents are one of the great success stories of mammaldom. More than 40% of all mammal species are rodents, and there are said to be more individual rodents in the world than all other mammals combined. Rats and mice have been the hidden beneficiaries of our own agricultural revolution, and they've travelled with us across the seas to every land in the world. They devastate our granaries and our health. Rats and their cargo of fleas were responsible for the Great Plague and arguably the Black Death. They've spread typhus and have been blamed for more human deaths in the second millennium than all wars and revolutions put together. When even the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are laid low, It will be rats that scavenge their remains, rats that will swarm over the ruins of civilization. Rodents are gnawing machines. They have a pair of very prominent incisor teeth at the front, perpetually growing to replace massive wear and tear. Rodents can gnaw their way through almost anything. Most are mouse-sized, but they range up through marmots, beavers, agoutis and maras to the sheep-sized capybaras of the South American waterways. Capybaras are prized for meat, not just because of their large size, but because, bizarrely, the Roman Catholic Church traditionally deemed them honorary fish for Fridays. Presumably because they live in water. Large as they are, modern capybaras are dwarfed by various giant South American rodents that went extinct only quite recently. The giant capybara, Protohydrocheirus, was the size of a donkey. Telecomis was an even larger rodent, the size of a small rhinoceros, which, like the giant capybara, went extinct at the time of the Great American Interchange, when the Isthmus of Panama ended South America's island status.
A world without rodents would be a very different world. It is less likely to come to pass than a world dominated by rodents and free of people. If nuclear war destroys humanity and most of the rest of life, a good bet for survival in the short term and for evolutionary ancestry in the long term is rats. I have a post-Armageddon vision. We and all other large animals are gone. Rodents emerge as the ultimate post-human scavengers. They gnaw their way through New York, London and Tokyo, digesting spilled larders, ghost supermarkets and human corpses, and turning them into new generations of rats and mice, whose racing populations explode out of the cities and into the countryside. When all the relics of human profligacy are eaten, populations crash again, and the rodents turn on each other and on the cockroaches scavenging with them. In a period of intense competition, short generations, perhaps with radioactively enhanced mutation rates, boost rapid evolution. With human ships and planes gone, islands become islands again, with local populations isolated, save for occasional lucky raftings, ideal conditions for evolutionary divergence. Within 5 million years, a whole range of new species replace the ones we know. Herds of giant grazing rats are stalked by saber-toothed predatory rats. Given enough time, will a species of intelligent, cultivated rats emerge? Will rodent historians and scientists eventually organize careful archaeological gnaws through the strata of our long compacted cities and reconstruct the peculiar and temporarily tragic circumstances that gave ratkind its big break? Back one more rendezvous to Rendezvous 11, we're joined about 85 million years ago by the Lauratiatheres, which is a very large group of animals, not until recently realized to be a group at all. They include the carnivores, the horses, the cattle, the bats, shrews, many other creatures, and we're now going to read the Hippos' tale. When I was a schoolboy studying Greek, I learned that hippos meant horse and potamos, river. Hippopotamuses were river horses. Later, when I gave up Greek and read zoology, I was not too disconcerted to learn that hippopotamuses weren't close to horses after all. Instead, they were classified firmly with pigs in the middle of the even-toed ungulates, or artiodactyls. I have now learned something so shocking that I'm still reluctant to believe it, but it looks as though I'm going to have to. Hippos' closest living relatives are whales. The even-toed ungulates include whales. Whales, needless to say, don't have hooves at all, whether odd or even-toed. Indeed, they don't have toes.
Whales are wonders of the world. They include the largest organisms that have ever moved. They swim with up and down movements of the spine, derived from the mammalian gallop, as opposed to the side-to-side wave motion of the spine of a swimming fish or a running lizard, or presumably a swimming ichthyosaur, which in other respects looked rather like a dolphin, except for the telltale vertical tail, where the dolphin's is horizontal for galloping through the sea. The front limbs are used for steering and stabilizing. There are no externally visible hind limbs at all, but some whales have small vestigial pelvic and leg bones buried deep in their bodies.
It would not be too hard to believe that whales are closer cousins to even-toed ungulates than they are to other mammals. A bit strange, perhaps, but not shocking to accept that some remote ancestor branched to the left and went to sea to give rise to the whales, while it branched to the right to give the even-toed ungulates. What is shocking is that according to the molecular evidence, whales are deeply embedded within the even-toed ungulates. Hippos are closer cousins to whales than hippos are to anything else, including other even-toed ungulates, such as pigs.
Something happened in the history of the whales that made them flip into evolutionary overdrive. Their closest cousins, the hippos, remained relatively static as normal, respectable artiodactyls. The whales evolved so much faster than all the rest of the artiodactyls that their origin within that group was obscured until molecular taxonomists came along and uncovered it. So what is special about the history of the whales?
When you write it down like that, the solution leaps off the page. Leaving the land and becoming wholly aquatic was a bit like going into outer space. When we go into space, we are weightless. A whale floats. Unlike a seal or a turtle, which still comes on land to breed, a whale never stops floating. It never has to contend with gravity. A hippo spends time in the water, but it still needs stout, tree trunk-like legs and strong leg muscles for the land. A whale doesn't need legs at all, and it doesn't have any. Think of a whale as what a hippo would like to be if only it could be freed from the tyranny of gravity. And of course, there are so many other odd things about living the whole time in the sea that it comes to seem far less surprising that whale evolution should have spurted as it did, leaving hippos behind, stranded on land and stranded in the middle of the artiodactyls. Much the same thing happened in the other direction 300 million years earlier, when our fish ancestors emerged from the water onto the land. If whales are glorified hippos, we are all glorified lungfish. The emergence of legless whales from within the middle of the artiodactyls, leaving the rest of the artiodactyls behind, should not seem more surprising than the emergence of four-legged land animals from one particular group of fish, leaving those fish behind. That, at any rate, is how I rationalize the hippo-whale connection and recover my lost zoological composure. Zoological composure be blowed. My attention was drawn to the following while this book was in its final stages of preparation. In 1866, the great German zoologist Ernst Haeckel drew up a schematic evolutionary tree of mammals. I'd often seen the full tree reproduced in histories of zoology, but I'd never before noticed the position of the whales and hippos in Haeckel's scheme. Haeckel presently placed the whales close to the artiodactyls, but the real stunner is where he put the hippos. He called them by the unflattering name obesa, and he classified them not in the artiodactyls, but as a tiny twig on the branch leading to the whales.
There is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. Ecclesiastes 1, 9-10.
Back now to Rendezvous 16, where that's about 310 million years ago, where we mammals are joined by all the reptiles, where reptiles includes birds, because birds are, of course, merely modified dinosaurs. The elephant bird's tale. From the tales of the Arabian Nights, the image that most stirred my childish imagination was the roc encountered by Sinbad the sailor, who at first thought this monstrous bird was a cloud come over the sun.
I had heard aforetime of pilgrims and travellers how in a certain island dwelleth a huge bird called the roc, which feedeth its young on elephants.
The legend of the rock, or ruck, surfaces in several stories of the Arabian Nights. It is mentioned by Marco Polo as living in Madagascar, and envoys from the king of Madagascar were said to have presented the Khan of Cathay with a rock feather. Michael Drayton invoked the monstrous bird's name to contrast it with the proverbially tiny wren.
All feathered things yet ever known to men, from the huge ruck unto the little wren.
What is the origin of the rock legend? And if it is pure fantasy, whence the recurrent connection with Madagascar?
Fossils from Madagascar tell us that a gigantic bird, the elephant bird Epionis maximus, lived there perhaps until as late as the 17th century, although more probably around 1000 AD. The elephant bird finally succumbed, perhaps partly through people stealing its eggs, which were up to 1 metre in circumference and would have provided as much food as 200 chicken eggs. The elephant bird was 3 metres tall and weighed nearly half a ton, as much as 5 ostriches. Unlike the legendary rock, which used its mighty wingspan to carry Sinbad aloft as well as elephants, the real elephant bird could not fly, and its wings were small, like an ostrich's. But though a cousin, it would be wrong to imagine it as a scaled-up ostrich. It was a more robust, heavy-set bird, a kind of feathered tank, with a big head and neck, unlike the ostrich's slender periscope. Given how legends readily grow and inflate, Epionis is a plausible progenitor of the rock.
The elephant bird was probably vegetarian, unlike the fabulously jumbophagous rock, and unlike earlier groups of giant carnivorous birds such as the Forus rhacoid family of the New World. They could grow to the same height as Epionis with a fearsomely hooked beak, which, as if in justification of their nickname of feathered tyrannosaurs, looks capable of swallowing a medium-sized lawyer whole. These monstrous cranes seem at first sight better casting for the role of the terrifying rock than Epionis, but they went extinct too long ago to have started the legend, and in any case Sinbad or his real-life Arab counterparts never visited the Americas.
The elephant bird of Madagascar is the heaviest bird known to have lived, but it's not the longest. Some species of moa could reach a height of 3.5 metres, but only if the neck was raised, as in one early museum mounting. In life, it seems they normally carried the head only a little way above the back. But the moa cannot have generated the rock legend, for New Zealand, too, was well beyond Sinbad's ken. About 10 moa species existed in New Zealand, and they ranged in size from turkey to double-sized ostrich. Moas are extreme among flightless birds in that they have no trace of wings at all, not even buried vestiges of wing bones. They thrived in both the North and South Islands of New Zealand until the recent invasion by the Maori people, about 1250 AD. They were easy prey, no doubt for the same reason as the dodo. Except for the extinct Haast's eagle, the largest eagle ever to have lived, they'd known no predators for tens of millions of years, and the Maoris slaughtered them all, eating the choicer parts and discarding the rest, belying, not for the first time, the wishful myth of the noble savage living in respectful harmony with his environment. By the time the Europeans arrived, only a few centuries after the Maoris, the last moa was gone. Legends and tall stories of sightings persist to this day, but the hope is forlorn. In the words of a plaintive song to be sung in a mournful New Zealand accent.
No moa, no moa, in old Aotearoa. Can't get 'em, they've et 'em. They've gone and there ain't no moa. The elephant bird's tale goes on to discuss the molecular taxonomy, not just of existing large flightless birds, ratite birds like ostriches and emus, but also of the elephant bird itself, because enough traces remain to get some DNA, and of moas, again, because enough DNA remains, with fascinating results. And the conclusion to the tale is about the geological theory of plate tectonics, the drifting of the continents. That's typical of the way I'm using the tales to give more general lessons about evolution. We now move back to Rendezvous 26 out of the 39 altogether, and this is where most of the invertebrate pilgrims greet us at 590 million years ago, the Barnacles' tale. When I was at boarding school, it was occasionally necessary to apologize to the housemaster for being late for dinner.
Sorry I'm late, sir. Orchestra practice.
Or whatever the excuse might be. On those occasions when there really was no good excuse and we had something to hide, we formed the habit of saying,
Sorry I'm late, sir. Barnacles.
He always nodded. He always nodded kindly, and I don't know whether he ever wondered what this mysterious out-of-school activity might be. It is possible that we were inspired by the example of Darwin, who devoted years of his life to barnacles so single-mindedly that his children were moved to ask in innocent puzzlement, after being shown round the house of some friends,
Well, then, where does your papa do his barnacles?
I'm not sure that we knew the Darwin story then, and I suspect that we invented the excuse because there is something about barnacles that seems too implausible to be a bluff. Barnacles are not what they seem. That applies to other animals too, and it's the theme of the Barnacles' tale.
Contrary to all appearances, barnacles are crustaceans. The ordinary acorn barnacles, which encrust the rocks like miniature limpets, helping your shoes not to slip if you're wearing them and hurting your feet if you're not, are completely unlike limpets internally. Inside the shell, they are distorted shrimps, lying on their backs, kicking their legs in the air. Their feet bear feathery combs or baskets with which they filter particles of food out of the water. Goose barnacles do the same thing, but instead of sheltering under a conical shell like an acorn barnacle, they sit on the end of a stout stalk. They get their name from yet another misunderstanding of the true nature of barnacles. Their wet, filtering feathers give them the appearance of a baby bird in its egg. In the days when people believed in spontaneous generation, a folk belief grew that goose barnacles hatched into geese. Specifically, Brantoleucopsis, the barnacle goose.
Most deceptive of all, indeed probably holding the record for animals not looking remotely like the thing that zoologists know them to be, are the parasitic barnacles such as Sacculina. Sacculina is not what it seems with a vengeance. Zoologists would never have realized that it is in fact a barnacle, but for its larva. The adult is a soft sac that clings to the underside of a crab and sends long, branching, plant-like roots inside to absorb nourishment from the crab's tissues. The parasite not only doesn't look like a barnacle, it doesn't look like a crustacean of any kind. It has completely lost all trace of the armor plating and all trace of the bodily segmentation that nearly all other arthropods have. It might as well be a parasitic plant or fungus. Yet, in terms of its evolutionary relationships, it is a crustacean, and not just a crustacean, but specifically a barnacle. By the way, Sacculina's branching root system is not indiscriminate in its invasion of the crab's tissues. It heads first for the crab's reproductive organs, which has the effect of castrating the crab. Is this just an accidental byproduct? Probably not. Castration not only sterilizes the crab. Like a fat bullock, the castrated crab, instead of concentrating on becoming a lean, mean reproducing machine, diverts resources towards getting larger, more food for the parasite. We're now going to leap straight past Canterbury, which is the origin of life, to the final chapter of the book, which is called The Host's Return. The genial host, having guided Chaucer and the other pilgrims from London to Canterbury and stood impresario to their tales, turned around and led them straight back to London. If I, having made the 4 billion-year pilgrimage to the dawn of life, now return to the present, it must be alone, for to presume upon evolution's following the same forward course twice would be to deny the rationale of our backward journey. evolution was never aimed at a particular endpoint.
And yet, if, to borrow a thought experiment of the American biologist Stuart Kauffman, evolution could be rerun again and again, maybe on an imaginary sample of Earth-like planets, how similar would the results be?
Like any zoologist, I can search my mental database of life on this planet and come up with an estimated answer to questions of the form, how many times has X evolved independently? The eye has evolved more than 40 times to 9 different designs. Echolocation, the trick of emitting sound pulses and navigating by accurate timing of the echoes, has evolved at least 4 times in bats, toothed whales, oilbirds, and cave swiftlets. Not as many times as the eye's tally of 40 to 60, but still often enough to make us suspect that if the conditions are right, sonar will evolve.
To do the counts more systematically would make a good research project. What systems have evolved many times independently, like eyes, or several times, like echolocation? Have some things evolved only once, or not at all? I suspect that we'd find certain potential evolutionary pathways which life is eager to go down. Other pathways have more resistance.
Elsewhere, I developed the analogy of a huge museum of all life, both real and conceivable, with corridors going off in many mathematical dimensions to represent evolutionary change, both real and conceivable. The corridor of eyes is wide open, almost beckoning. Other corridors are blocked off by barriers that are hard or even impossible to surmount. Evolution repeatedly races down the easy corridors and just occasionally and unexpectedly leaps one of the hard barriers.
But how about things that have evolved only once, or not at all? The wheel, with a true, freely rotating bearing, seems to have evolved only once in bacteria, before being finally invented in human technology. Language, too, has apparently evolved only in us, that is to say, at least 40 times less often than the eye. It is surprisingly hard to think of good ideas that have evolved only once.
I put the challenge to my Oxford colleague, the entomologist and naturalist George McGavin, and he came up with a nice list, but still a short one compared with the list of things that have evolved many times. Bombardier beetles of the genus Brachynes are unique in Dr. McGavin's experience in mixing chemicals to make an explosion. The ingredients are made and held in separate, obviously, glands. When danger threatens, they are squirted into a chamber near the rear end of the beetle where they explode, forcing noxious, caustic and boiling hot liquid out through a directed nozzle at the enemy. The case is well known to creationists who love it. They think it is self-evidently impossible to evolve by gradual degrees because the intermediate stages would all explode. I enjoyed demonstrating the error of this argument during my Royal Institution Christmas lectures for children shown on BBC television in 1991. Donning a Second World War helmet and inviting nervous members of the audience to leave, I mixed hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, the 2 ingredients of the Bombardier explosion. Nothing happened. It didn't even get warm. The explosion requires a catalyst. I raised the concentration of catalyst gradually, which steadily increased the hot whoosh to a satisfactory climax. In nature, the beetle provides the catalyst and would have had no difficulty in gradually and safely increasing the dose over evolutionary time.
Next in the McGavin list is the archerfish, which may be unique in shooting a missile to knock prey down from a distance. It comes to the surface of the water and spits a mouthful at a perched insect, knocking it down into the water where it eats it. Spitting spiders, family Cytodidae, are a bit different again. Lacking the fleetness of a wolf spider or the net of a web spider, the spitting spider chucks a venomous glue some distance towards its prey, pinning it to the ground until the spider arrives and bites it to death. This is different from the archerfish technique of knocking prey down.
McGavin's next candidate for an evolutionary one-off is a beauty. It is the diving bell spider, Argaronita aquatica. This spider lives and hunts entirely underwater, but unlike dolphins, dugongs, turtles, freshwater snails, and other land animals that have returned to water, I should have said like dolphins, dugongs, etc., that have returned to water, it needs to breathe air. Unlike all those other exiles, Argyroneta constructs its own diving bell. It spins it of silk. Silk is the universal solution to any spider problem, attached to an underwater plant. The spider goes to the surface to collect air, which it carries in the same way as some water bugs in a lair trapped by body hairs. But unlike the bugs, which just carry the air like a scuba cylinder wherever they go, the spider takes it to its diving bell, where it unloads it to replenish the supply. The spider sits in the diving bell, watching for prey, and it stores and eats prey there once caught.
But George McGavin's champion example of a one-off is the larva of an African horsefly, Tabanus. Predictably, in Africa, the pools of water in which the larvae live and feed dry up. Each larva buries itself in the mud and pupates. The adult fly emerges from the baked mud and flies off to feed on blood, eventually to complete the cycle by laying eggs in pools of water when the rains return. The buried larva is vulnerable to a predictable danger. As mud dries out, it cracks, and there's a risk that a crack will tear right across the grub's refuge. It could theoretically save itself if it could somehow engineer a way for any crack that approaches it to be diverted around it instead. And it does indeed achieve this in a truly wonderful and probably unique manner. Before burying itself in its own pupation chamber, it first corkscrews its way down into the mud in a spiral. It then corkscrews its way back to the surface in an opposite spiral. Finally, it dives into the mud straight down the center between the two spirals, and that is its resting place through the bad times until water returns.
Now you see what this means. The larva is encased in a cylinder of mud whose circular boundary has been weakened in advance by the preliminary spiral burrowing. This means that when a crack snakes across the drying mud, if it hits the edge of the cylindrical column, instead of cutting straight across the middle, it goes instead in a curved bypass around the edge of the cylinder, and the larva is spared. It is just like the perforations around a stamp, which stop you tearing the stamp across. Dr. McGavin believes that this ingenious trick is literally unique to this one genus of horsefly.
This kind of comparative exercise, counting which things evolve often and which seldom, might help us to predict things about life outside this planet. Which features of life are parochial and which universal? This is a question that biologists ask less often than they should.
If, as returning host, I reflect on the whole pilgrimage of which I have been a grateful part, my overwhelming reaction is one of amazement. Amazement not only at the extravaganza of details that we have seen, amazement too at the very fact that there are any such details to be had at all on any planet. The universe could so easily have remained lifeless and simple, just physics and chemistry, just the scattered dust of the cosmic explosion that gave birth to time and space. The fact that it did not, the fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing, some 10 billion years after the universe evolved out of literally nothing, is a fact so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. Even that is not the end of the matter. Not only did evolution happen, it eventually led to beings capable of comprehending the process, and even of comprehending the process by which they comprehend it. This pilgrimage has been a trip, not just in the literal sense, but in the countercultural sense I met when a young man in California in the 1960s. The most potent hallucinogen on sale in Haight or Ashbury or Telegraph Avenue would be tame by comparison. If it's amazement you want, the real world has it all. Not to stray outside the covers of this book, think of Venus's girdle, migrating jellyfish and tiny harpoons. Think of the platypus's radar and the electric fish, of the horsefly larva with the apparent foresight to preempt cracks in the mud. Think redwood, think peacock, think starfish with its piped hydraulic power, Think cichlid fish of Lake Victoria evolving how many orders of magnitude faster than Lingula, Limulus, lungfish or Latimeria? It is not pride in my book, but reverence for life itself that encourages me to say, if you want a justification for the latter, open the former anywhere at random. And reflect on the fact that although this book has been written from a human point of view, another book could have been written in parallel for any of 10 million starting pilgrims. Not only is life on this planet amazing and deeply satisfying to all whose senses have not become dulled by familiarity, the very fact that we have evolved the brain power to understand our evolutionary genesis redoubles the amazement and compounds the satisfaction. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, and there's a microphone there if it's necessary.
I was just wondering if you'd ever seen a really wonderful book that came out like 15 years ago called After Man.
Yes.
I think the author's name was Dixon.
Dougal Dixon.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. I seem to recall there was it's basically a visual interpretation of, or prediction of what might happen if humans disappeared, say like 50 million years later, and even longer. And I seem to recall one of the neat ones was carnivorous rabbits. But
I should have acknowledged Dougal Dixon in the book. I do, but as you've gathered, this is a very highly condensed readings. Dougal Dixon was the inspiration for that apocalyptic passage about rats taking over the world.
Or rabbits.
Thank you very much.
In your lecture, you mentioned rewinding the evolutionary tape, and I was wondering if you could compare that to Stephen Jay Gould's discussion in his book on the Burgess Shale. I think you might mention that in The Devil's Chaplain, but I can't recall for sure.
Stephen Jay Gould independently put forward that same thought experiment of rewinding the tape of evolution. Stuart Kauffman suggested it earlier. The point of the thought experiment is to say how similar would evolution look if it happened more than once. Kauffman's thought experiment involves rerunning it a statistical sample of times over and over again and actually counting the number of times you get similar results. Gould's point is that life is overwhelmingly contingent, and so he would predict that every time you ran it, you'd get something totally different. It's possible to take a different point of view. The Cambridge geologist whose name I'm blocking on, Simon Conway Morris, has written a book in which he argues that, quite the contrary, if you ran it again, you'd end up not only with a similar range of types, but even with something pretty similar to humans. In The Ancestor's Tale, I take an intermediate position between these two.
This question goes more toward the political aspects of the book. It's clear you're taking on the evolution or the creationist theme that is so prevalent in this country, and I'm just wondering whether you run into that in Britain, and would you compare and contrast the battles that are going on?
This book is actually not an advocacy of evolution. It simply assumes that evolution is true, which it is. Some of my other books could be regarded as advocacies of evolution. This one is an attempt to look at the history of the way evolution actually happened. You asked me to compare Britain and the United States in this regard. We do have our creationists and our nutcases in Britain. The difference is they don't have political power.
Welcome to Washington, where evolution has been temporarily slowed for another 4 years. My question is regarding in your reading tonight, you mentioned at one point the date 1000 A.D. I was wondering, would you comment on the use of the less Christian-centric dating system of CE for Common Era and BCE for before the Common Era instead of before Christ and Annus Domini?
Yes, I don't have too much of a problem with what I regard as a kind of tokenism. BC and AD have entered into the language, and as far as I'm concerned, they no longer have their original meaning. I am aware that some people would prefer to call it CE, BCE, but I'm really not that bothered either way. I'm interested in what's true. I don't care too much about the tokenism. My fear about tokenism is that it may distract attention from things that really matter, such as, for example, the fact that churches in this country and my own get huge tax breaks. Now, that's the kind of thing I would like to protest about, rather than to go for tokenism, like, for example, I don't know, the 10 Commandments in schools or something of that sort, which doesn't bother me so much.
I would be interested in your response to the following. If you consider intelligence to be the ability to act within an environment, take in information, and then respond to that information to manipulate the environment, might we say that DNA and genetics itself is basically intelligence, and that our intelligence is a subset of basically that intelligence? Now, the other point I wanted to raise was that, in a sense, we are basically the Big Bang talking. Okay, now the question is this. If most of the species disappear, like 90% of the former species are gone, or some large percentage, what does that say for our role or our position in evolution and the likelihood of us continuing, or, you know, stuff like that?
The first question, is DNA intelligent? That, I think, is an interesting sort of poetic thought. It's one that quite appeals to me. In some ways, it's quite misleading. In other ways, it's quite insightful. There is a sense in which DNA does process information and, as it were, spew it out again. In one of my earlier books, Unweaving the Rainbow, I have a chapter called The Genetic Book of the Dead, which suggests that because the DNA that comes down to the present from the past has been selected in past environments, you can in a way regard the DNA of the present as a kind of stored database of the past, a kind of stored memory of the past. And it almost does behave in an intelligent way. But it can be misleading if people confuse it with what one might call real intelligence, which is the kind of thing that's shown by computers and people, where you actually process information on the fly.
It's questionable whether we have real intelligence. But
it is questionable, certainly. I think I better just stick to one question per person, so I think I'll stop it there.
Given that in the rest of the world, evolution is a sort of a, or the rest of the civilized world, evolution is sort of a widely accepted fact. Do you view the sort of subgenres that have spun off of evolution, such as evolutionary psychology, as legitimate, or do they have a long way to go?
Well, evolutionary psychology is the new name for what we used to call sociobiology. That this is an animal that keeps changing its spots as a sort of cryptic strategy to evade the scrutiny of left-wing ideologues who are constantly after it with a hatchet. Evolutionary psychology is a way of thinking about humans and interpreting the psychology that we have, the predispositions that we have, as shaped by our evolutionary past in Africa over the past 1,000,000 years or so. I'm thoroughly in favor of it. I subscribe to the broad outlines of evolutionary psychology. They tend to regard the brain or the mind as divided into modules. Each module functions for a particular purpose, a particular life need, rather as we have eyes for seeing and ears for hearing. the mind is divided into modules. There's a module for calculating kinship. There's a module for language. There's a module for calculating debts owed and repaid, that kind of thing. I find it very persuasive, and I recommend the various books on evolutionary psychology that you'll find, for example, those of David Buss and Leda Cosmides and John Tooby.
Do you have any comment on how evolution brings about varying lifespans between various species?
This is a difficult question. Lifespans in different species vary a great deal, and it isn't quite obvious why. It seems to be heavily correlated with size. Large animals tend to live longer, and you can kind of see why that would be. It takes a longer time to bring a child up to maturity, and so the whole cycle is spaced out more. Some species devote very little effort, very little resources into each child, and they rely upon having lots and lots of children, some of which may survive. Other species devote a lot of resources to a few children, and then it's much, the economics works out obviously that you want each child to live a long time in order to have lots of children. So it's partly based on that, but there is a lot more to it than that. There is an astonishingly good correlation actually between lifespan and size, and that's an empirical fact, and I'm not sure that we entirely understand what it's due to.
Thank you. I was hesitant to ask this question until I saw that you'd used Chaucer as a structural device in your book, but I've noticed that my daughter's interest in science blossomed after I presented her with Douglas Adams' work. It was just extraordinary to see. So this question is the role of science in literature and the role of literature in promoting science, and whether you have any specific views. And I believe you knew Adams, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he was a dear friend and is sadly missed. He himself studied English literature at university, and he afterwards said that he regarded scientific literature as, in a sense, had almost usurped the role which in the 19th century was held by the novel. I think that was perhaps going a bit far, but the way he put it was that in the 19th century you went to the novel for your insights into life and humanity. And nowadays you go to science, at least in his case, and he increasingly was reading science books, although he was extremely well read in literature. I regard science as a superb vehicle for literature. I know of a professor of English literature in this country who is running a campaign to have the Nobel Prize for Literature given to a scientist. She feels it's time that the Nobel Prize for Literature was just sometimes given to something other than a novelist, and why not a scientist?
Like, give it to Churchill, they can give it to a scientist.
Churchill received it for his history of, yes, yeah. So it has been given for non-fiction before, but I think it's never been given to a scientist before.
Thank you.
Thank
No
you for your
comment.
writings and presentation. But I was alarmed by what I thought. I thought you were suggesting that human and machine intelligence were similar. Don't you find that a counterproductive?
I kind of threw that in order to rile a few people.
You succeeded,
yeah.
right? As a computer scientist, it seems mind-limiting to suggest that machines
Yes.
would be built in the model of human form.
Yes, I would certainly agree that computers as they are at present built are not modeled on minds and vice versa. I was trying to make the contrast it was the question, if you remember, about is DNA intelligent?
Yes.
And I was trying to say that in the sense in which DNA is not intelligent, both human brains and computers are, but that doesn't mean to say that human brains and computers are intelligent in exactly the same way as each other.
Right.
They certainly aren't.
The evolution of computers would be limited by such a assumption.
Maybe, yes. Yeah. Three more, okay.
Hello. I'm sure you've heard that just recently paleontologists have discovered the remains of, I think it was 7 skeletons of tiny humans in Southeast Asia. And I was wondering if you had given any thought to where that might fit into our human evolutionary tree.
Homo floresiensis, one skeleton, which of quite a complete skeleton, has been found on the island of Flores It's about 3 feet high. It's got a very small brain. This particular skeleton is 18,000 years old. Nobody knows when they went extinct, or even if they went extinct, but presumably they did. There was an explosion on Flores 12,000 years ago, which may well have done for them, or maybe Homo sapiens did for them. They've been found with stone tools, suggesting that they might have made those stone tools. If so, they probably hunted giant rats, which still do actually live on the island. What more can I say about them? They were probably descended from Homo erectus, probably a population of Homo erectus, which lived in those parts, got across onto the island of Flores. When animals get onto islands, they very often either get very large, like the Komodo dragon, which also lived there, or they get small. And in the case of Flores woman, I should say, since the skeleton found is female, it got small. So this is an absolutely stunning find. It's one of the most exciting things that's happened in science for a long time. One can't help wondering about the glorious possibility that they might still be there. But I fear it's not likely, but wouldn't it be great?
Thank you.
I don't think I need that. I wanted to just ask you, I'm a biology teacher, and I'm teaching currently origins of life and evolution theory to the students at my school, and I was just wondering about your thoughts on the way that humans are currently impacting the environment and our role on influencing the way or the direction that evolution is currently taking.
Richard Leakey has suggested that we are currently involved in causing what he calls the sixth extinction. He looks at 5 other mass extinctions over geological time, and it's a sobering thought that we might be doing that. So one of the impacts we're having is causing the extinction of many, many species and ecosystems. But you're also asking about our impact on the way evolution goes. We've already been influencing evolution in a very weird way by artificial selection, by breeding cattle and dogs and things, so that they're really very different from their ancestors. You'd never think that a Pekingese was actually a wolf. And that's one of the weird things that humans have done. That's taking the selection part of the Darwinian equation. Just very recently, it's becoming possible to influence the mutation part of the Darwinian equation, actually changing the genes themselves. And again, it may be that future generations will look back on this time as a major watershed in evolution, the moment when an evolved creature developed the technology and the brain power to actually control evolution and influence its future. If that happens, it would be the first time ever in the whole 4 billion year history of life that foresight, true planning for the future becomes an influence on evolution.
Okay,
I think we have one more. One more.
Hi, I'm taking an introduction to sociobiology class at the George Washington University at Foggy Bottom. And I was wondering, we've read a variety of authors that have contradicted each other about what sociobiology actually is. And I was wondering if I could have your opinion on the difference in thought between sociobiologists and non-sociobiologists, excluding creationists.
Sociobiology is a name that was coined by Edward O. Wilson in 1975. He wanted to bring the whole of social evolution under one umbrella, including controversially human. And the last chapter of Wilson's book is the one that is controversial, partly because I think of territorial disputes with existing social scientists who didn't take kindly to what they saw as a kind of takeover bid of their subject. Most of sociobiology is non-controversial. It's about non-human animals, and it's the application, I suppose, of evolutionary theory, especially genetic evolutionary theory, to social organization and social life. There are, of course, controversies within sociobiology. There is also controversy within biologists about sociobiology, because there are some biologists who object to it on various grounds, which I find specious, and I'm not the best person to expound. But they are very vocal, and they can do that job for themselves. This chap's very...
This is probably a really, really naive question, but you said we evolved from almost nothing. Where did the almost nothing come from?
Well, evolution proper began when the first self-replicating entity came into existence, the first gene in the broad sense, not DNA, but the first gene in the broad sense. On any planet in the universe, once the laws of chemistry give rise to a molecule which makes copies of itself, accurate copies of itself, but not too accurate, then natural selection can get going and evolution can get going. By almost nothing, I mean that compared to the fabulous complexity of life as we know it today, the origin of life was almost nothing.
Richard Dawkins teaches science at Oxford University and is the author of several books on science and evolution. The Ancestor's Tale is published by Houghton Mifflin. Get information on the web at houghtonmifflinbooks.com.